Fred Stone and his cow Lila Rose. And I will talk a little bit about Fred. So, oops, why? Oh, there we go. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening here in Maine. Um, so back in about 2016-ish, Fred, who is the farmer I just showed, Fred Stone and his wife Laura, they own Stone Ridge Farm in Arundel. Through some various water testing that some spot testing that the federal government was doing on drinking water and PFAS, they found some high levels of PFAS in some wells in the public water systems in Kennebunkport and Wells Water District. And they backtracked to try to figure out where that contamination was coming from. And it was coming from Fred Stone's farm. And so they let Fred know that this was happening. Fred tested his milk. He was under, I just want to make this clear, no legal obligation to do any of this. But he did the right thing and he tested his milk and they found that there was like massively high levels of PFAS in his milk and in his water that he was using, both in his home and to feed his cows. Some of the highest levels of PFAS that they'd seen in the US at that time. I think it was the highest. And it was determined that Fred's contamination was because of land application of something of biosolids or sludge, which is basically waste from wastewater treatment facilities. And the land application of sludge is a thing that happens all over the US. We are not the only state that does it. It is something under the Clean Water Act that was put into place to deal with sewage sludge because for a lot of the time people were either just like dumping it in the river. Wastewater treatment facilities didn't really have a place to put it, so it was part of the reason why the river outside Rumford was so contaminated. So they decided that applying it on farmland was a good beneficial use of sludge because it was high in nutrients. It helped municipalities because it was cheaper for them to spread it on farmland than it was for them to landfill it. And also it helps the farmers because it was a very cheap source of fertilizer. So this is a thing that happens all over the US. It is not a Maine specific issue. Stone Ridge Farm finds the contamination. Because of the contamination at Stone Ridge Farm, the department decides to set standards for PFAS in milk. And they start spot testing milk across the state to see if they have other milk that's ending up on the shelves that's highly contaminated. And they found some, and they backtracked that to Tozier Farm in Fairfield. And so in the midst of this, because of what was happening on Fred's farm, because of kind of the spot treatment that the department was doing, the governor also sets up a PFAS task force in the middle of this. It's a task force combined of agency folks, advocates, and public health officials to kind of figure out what's happening with PFAS in Maine. So we're doing the spot testing. The PFAS task force is working. They find contamination at Tozier Farm. Tozier Farm is in Fairfield. It had even higher levels of PFAS in their milk and in their water than Fred had. And so the Department of Environmental Protection started like kind of testing around the Tozier Farm. And because of the way the Tozier Farm was situated within the aquaculture, the runoff from the sludge at the Tozier Farm highly contaminated several residential wells in the Fairfield area. So we're starting to find this Tozier Farm issues. This is, 2020. There's legislation going on at the same time that I'll talk about a little separately, but like they find the contamination on Tozier Farm. Tozier Farm highly contaminates several residential wells around Fairfield. I think they're up to about over 200 as of right now. So because of this, some of the legislation, the state starts testing soil and water for PFAS. They start finding high levels of PFAS in some of the fish. There's fish advisories that are put out. They start testing some of the game around Fairfield because that's a hot spot in the state. They start putting warnings out to people to not eat the turkey and the deer and stuff that is caught and shot, particularly around the Fairfield area because of PFAS. The legislature is doing all this amazing stuff to try to fix this. And then in 2024, we have this AFFF spill in Brunswick that happened just a few months ago, which was the largest toxic chemical spill in the state of Maine, 6th largest in the US. So not only do we have this like land contamination of sludge, we also now have this AFFF spill, which is firefighting foam. Sorry, I'll try not to talk in acronyms. AFFF is aqueous film forming firefighting foam. And so we have the AFFF spill, we have the land contamination of farms. Basically, Maine is like dealing kind of with this PFAS crisis. In the process of doing all this, oh, for some reason, this is not letting me change. There we go. So in the process of all of this, the legislature is kind of on its own track, doing this stuff to try to deal with what we're finding in terms of the contamination. So the first thing we do in the 129th legislature is a very small step of banning PFAS in food packaging. This seems like a small step, but ingestion is one of the largest sources of exposure, particularly for children. And so getting it out of food packaging, and that was in things like burger wraps and pizza trays and microwave popcorn, all of these things use PFAS because of its grease resistance. And so we became the second state to ban PFAS in food packaging. And then while that's happening, all of this other stuff is going on around these farms. So when the 130th legislature comes back, they hit the ground running. I'm not going to go through all of these because this would take forever, but just a couple of highlights. There were no standards for PFAS in drinking water. The state set interim standards for PFAS in drinking water at the time. It was one of the strongest standards in the country. We banned, and this was a huge deal. We were the first state to do this. Actually, this original law was one of the first in the world that banned non-essential uses of PFAS in products. So like any product that was coming into the state of Maine that used PFAS, would not be allowed to use PFAS unless they could prove to the department that the use of it was essential for the health, safety, or functioning of society. So we have this amazing ban of PFAS products. We banned it in AFFF firefighting foam. We also, at the same time, required the Department of Environmental Protection to figure out where all of the sludge had been applied on farmlands across the state and test those farms for PFAS in their drinking water and on their soil. That is still ongoing. It's going to take them a couple of more years to do that. What they found in the process of doing that is that we have about 80 contaminated farms in the state of Maine, highly contaminated farms. 5 of them have had to shut down because of the level of contamination. And we've got about 600 and something contaminated wells. So this testing is happening. We are requiring the department to do that. They are still in the process of doing that. And like all of this stuff happened in the 130th legislature. The other thing that we did in the 130th legislature, which was also first in the nation, was ban the land application of biosolids. So this is the banning the land application of sludge. We're seeing the contamination on the Stone Ridge farm. We're seeing it on the Tozier farm. Now we're starting to see it in other farms because when the department started doing the testing for where sludge had been spread, they set up a map to show where the licenses had been given. Now, just because you got a license to spread didn't mean you did, but a lot of particularly organic farmers kind of freaked out when they saw that their farms were on these spots. And so they started to reach out to the department. And so we had a lot of particularly organic farmers that were coming to the legislature and saying, you know, I have high levels of PFAS on my farm. It is impacting my farming ability. It is, you know, the people don't want to buy from me because my farm is on this map, all this type of stuff. So the legislature was like, okay, we can't contaminate any more farms. We're going to ban the land application of biosolids moving forward. So that also passed the 130th, first in the nation to do that. You know, the other thing that we did at that time, because so many farms were being impacted, was we set up an advisory fund, about $60 million in the governor's budget, that was meant to help with income replacement, farm buybacks, and then medical help, you know, to help the farmers that are particularly impacted by PFAS. So the 130th legislature did amazing work. We were so proud of all the stuff, and they did all of these amazing things, mostly because we had these farmers and these well owners that stood up and told their stories in committees, to the point on a couple of hearings, we just had like legislators sobbing because of the stories coming from these people and what was happening to their families. So the 130th legislature does all this amazing work. We transition into the 130th. First, we regulate it in bottled water. We did amend the products law to make it a little easier for industry to comply with. We had several attempts to weaken several of our PFAS laws that we managed to deal with most of them, except for, like I said, we had to amend the products law. Um, oh, okay, let me just get all these out here. And so we do all this work in the 130th. We fight back attacks in the 131st. The current legislature that's happening right now, we also have some bills in that we're hoping to like deal with some things around PFAS. So it's expensive to get your wells tested. So we're trying to get the state to cover the cost of residential well testing for low-income Mainers. Landlords are not required to test and disclose to their tenants. We're trying to make that be a thing. Because of the spill in Brunswick, we want to do an inventory and collection program of AFFF to get it out of all of the communities that we have across the state, because some people still have it. You might remember that I said we banned AFFF firefighting a couple of years ago. The problem became is that under that law, the manufacturers were supposed to buy it back, but a lot of the manufacturers had since gone out of business. So a lot of the communities that we have that still have AFFF had no place to put it. And so this inventory and collection system will hopefully help them with that. We also want to set health protective MCLs for PFAS in drinking water. So as I mentioned, we set interim standards a few years ago. We set those standards at 20 parts per trillion for a combination of 6 PFAS. So if your public water system tests over that, then they're supposed to treat for PFAS. At the same time, the EPA was doing work around PFAS in drinking water. They set like really amazing health protective MCLs for 6 PFAS in drinking water, to the point to where advocates were shocked, because the EPA is generally really not great on chemicals, but they set these amazing drinking water standards. And then the Trump administration took over and they just announced a couple of weeks ago, or about a week ago, that they are weakening significantly the standards that the Biden administration put into place, and giving water districts more time to implement or to set up treatment facilities. Under the previous law, under the previous EPA ruling, they had till 2029. Now they'll have till 2031, and they're only setting standards for 2 PFAS instead of 6. So we have a bill that has made it out of committee that will codify those original standards from the EPA that they put in August of 2024 into Maine state statute, so that Maine drinking water will be protected at those health protective levels that the EPA put forward. That unfortunately does not help anybody else in the US, but for those that live in Maine that are on public water systems, they will still get those stronger health protective drinking water standards, which is great. So we've done all of this work. We've also seen several attempts to weaken all of our current PFAS laws. There was just a bill in ENR yesterday that wanted to change the definition of PFAS in statute, which would have severely weakened almost all of our PFAS laws. Thankfully, the committee voted it down. So that should go away, but that will continue to happen because industry hates the definition that we have in PFAS, because it encompasses every single PFAS. And that's about 15,000 of them. And it's in so many things, it's so ubiquitous that it really interferes with the chemical industry's ability to make money if they have to regulate it out of all of their products. So let me stop right there and see if there are like PFAS specific questions. And then I want to kind of talk a little bit about this kind of industry pitting climate activists against environmental public health activists. But I just dumped a bunch of information on you guys about PFAS. So if you have questions, and I also realized I did not tell you what PFAS was, which is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is the things we put in products to make them grease resistant, stain resistant, waterproof, all of that type of stuff. And they've been around since the 1950s. So Mike, you had your question up first, and then Corinne or
Um,
Corrine? Sorry, I'm
yeah,
not.
yeah. Is it fair to say that the sludge that the farmers put on their fields, that's been the primary contaminant for PFAS contamination? It's not necessarily packaging, but the amount of sludge that went on. So did this come from, it must have come from like waste treatment plants.
Yep.
So
Yep.
this tracks back to like a town or a county that's treating um, what's coming out of their waste treatment plant, correct? So
Yes.
has anybody been held accountable for that? And is there legislation to keep that from happening? The context of my question is, I don't know if you're familiar with Pease Air Force Base
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
they dumped firefighting chemicals,
Yes.
PFAS chemicals all over the place. They looked around and said, "Hey, this is a good place to dump everything."
Yeah.
Well, they
Yeah.
there were two wells at the base, and when I tried to figure out, I was there as an Air Force brat, and when I tried to track it back, the government nobody in the government will say anything other than if you were active duty, yeah, we might talk to you, but all right. So you get where I'm going at.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
at some point, somebody needs we need to know what happened, like, and then prevent that from happening again.
So most of Maine's contamination is because of the land application of sludge, which is comes out of our wastewater. So like everything you flush down the toilet, everything you flush down the drain, all of that stuff goes into the wastewater treatment facility. And because PFAS is so ubiquitous, ends up in our wastewater treatment facilities, they were spreading the sludge on farmland. Maine is a highly rural state. We don't have a lot of industry. Some of the contamination is also probably from Bath Iron Works in the area around Bath. There's PFAS contamination in Casco Bay. Some of that is probably from Bath Iron Works. Um, Obviously, the spill in Brunswick from the AFFF. There's other AFFF contamination probably across the state too, because they used to train with it. And so they would just like spray it this is like airports, former military bases, all those types of things. Some communities used to, during parades and like the 4th of July, spray it for the kids to play in. Like it's a it's a big problem. Um, and then like other states like North Carolina, Minnesota, these places that have West Virginia, these places that have like DuPont plants or Chemours plants or 3M plants where they actually make the PFAS, that is the major source of contamination from them because it's coming from the factory. But for Maine, it's the biosolids. Now, or sludge. I should not, we try not to call it biosolids and say what it is, which is sludge. Biosolids sounds so like polite and happy. Um, Brunswick is a former military base, and so that contamination is actually similar to Pease. It was firefighting foam left over from the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is never really going to take responsibility for what they have done. I believe they might be helping treat some drinking water wells around some of these impacted communities, but they are not going to admit that they did something wrong and have to pay for it. Now, the state of Maine is suing the chemical manufacturers, and they have two lawsuits. They have two class action lawsuits. They have one because of the farmland contamination, and we're actually really the only state that is using that as like a reason for suing for like damages, and we can quantify it, right? The other lawsuit we have is around the AFFF firefighting foam, and not because of Brunswick. This lawsuit was filed before then because we knew that there was contamination from AFFF firefighting foam. So the AG's office is currently suing Chemours, 3M, DuPont, um, to try to get them to take responsibility for it. Now, what happens with that money is like another conversation that needs to be happened. The state will get reimbursed for the money that they've spent. But like if we have good settlements, there will be more money. And so that is a conversation that we need to have. Like, what happens to that? From our perspective, it should go into a fund to help pay for drinking water remediation, other sort of remediation and cleanup and stuff like that. That is a larger conversation that will have to happen down the road. And as everybody is well aware, class action lawsuits, take forever. Oh, I wanted to answer a question. I'm sorry. Okay. She said I answered a question. Winston, you had a question? Oh, and Kat too. Sorry. Didn't see what it first.
Uh, Kat, you can go first if you'd like.
Hi, I noticed on the previous slide that you had landfill leachate up, but you didn't
Yes.
bring it up. And so since I live by Juniper Ridge landfill, yeah, thank you. My first question or comment is, everyone takes it for granted that wastewater treatment sludge is contaminated with PFAS, but nobody seems to be talking about why. And so, and I noticed you mentioned treating soil and water. And I'm wondering how you are doing that, because up here we're currently going through Juniper Ridge relicensing and expansion. And part of the requirements for them to get the permit is that they clean their leachate to drinking water standards,
Right.
which is not gonna happen, so.
Well, it could.
uh, Well, the thing is that when you take wastewater treatment sludge and you put it on a landfill, you're now contaminating the whole landfill.
Right.
And that kind of distills down into the leachate, and then that gets sent to Nine Dragons in Old Town, which is a closed mill with a wastewater treatment plant, which is not treating it for PFAS.
Correct.
So we end up with this being like constantly dumped into the Penobscot River just below Indian Island. So have you seen any? Like I've heard foam refractionation and all these other chemical ways of doing it. But
yeah, so yes, the leachate is a huge problem. So what we are doing because of the ban on the land application of sludge is it is being landfilled. Is it being landfilled in Juniper Ridge landfill? Landfilling is the best of bad options at this point because incineration, there's no real technology that is currently in place that can take the PFAS out of the sludge. They're working on it. This is happening. It's going to be a few years before they get to a point to where there's some sort of technology that's available. We tried in concert with the land application ban to pass legislation to require leachate treatment from Juniper Ridge. It did not. Like the committee turned it into a study. That study kind of went nowhere. We have been working with Don't Waste Maine, which is the community activist group up around Juniper Ridge landfill, to continually try to get to force that landfill, which is managed by Casella, which is a multi-billion-dollar corporation who constantly claims that they can't treat it, shouldn't have to pay for it, all of this, like, quite frankly, excuse my French, bullshit. And I can rant about Casella and their nonsense for days. So as you said, the leachate is going to Nine Dragons. Nine Dragons is shut down. Even if Nine Dragons wasn't shut down, it doesn't treat for PFAS. It treats for heavy metals, treats for some of that other stuff. So the PFAS would still be going into the Penobscot River. The Penobscot River is cultural significance to the Penobscot Nation. This is a huge environmental justice issue for the Penobscot Nation. We've been working with the Penobscot Nation for a while to try to, get a handle on this. I will say there is some good news. As you mentioned, part of the for one thing, we don't want Juniper Ridge to be expanded. So we're opposed to their attempts to expand their landfill. Part of their new licensing agreement with the state is that they will have to treat their leachate to drinking water standards. Now, those drinking water standards are probably the 20 parts per trillion. That is what the state currently has, not the 4 parts per trillion. But regardless, they will have to treat it. That is a possibility. Anson-Madison Wastewater Treatment Facility, which I have toured, and they have walked me through their process, can treat leachate to drinking water standards. So for Casella to say that they cannot do it is utter nonsense. The other thing I will say is that Waste Management, which manages Crossroads landfill in Norridge Walk, is in the process of installing a sludge dryer, which will limit, it is not going to get the PFAS out of the sludge, but what it does is, and there's a whole bunch of nonsense going on around Juniper Ridge that I could talk about for an hour, and I will not. But that sludge dryer, no. I'm trying not to let myself go down a thing about out-of-state bulky waste.
Right. Well, yeah, they're saying that the drying facility will allow shrink it down from like 80,000 tons to 8,000 tons, and it will be dry so that you won't need to use bulking agents, which Casella is bringing in from out of state.
Exactly.
Bulky waste and construction and demolition.
Yeah. And that causes a whole another host of issues. So because Crossroads should have their dryer up and running in a year. Crossroads is also installing a leachate treatment system and some other, they mentioned there's 2 treatment systems they're putting in there for PFAS. They are doing it without being forced by the state to do so. They are doing it with their own money and they're not whining about it.
But they bring in wastewater treatment sludge from out of state.
They won't have to if we can get no, they won't have to if we can get contracts from Casella to Waste Management. And so that's what needs to happen, is that we need to get everybody that goes to renew their licenses with Casella needs to, and so once again, not going to get into it. There's some stuff we're
Okay.
working on at the legislative level.
Well,
that we're
I just
trying to do
wondered,
to
we'll
force
get
them.
away from the expensive things. Have you ever looked into phytoremediation as a solution? Because that's been shown to be very successful in removing toxins from soil and
And I'm
water.
not a scientist, so I would leave that
It's
to,
just
yeah.
using hyperaccumulator plants to remove the PFAS.
Yeah, oh yeah, for like the Micmac
Right.
Nation was doing. The
Right.
problem becomes with that is that you still have the contaminated plant that you have to do something.
But there are solutions to that now, and I would be happy to send it to you after the meeting, because I agree, let's not give Casella any more time. You know?
Yeah.
We've sucked up enough of my life. So, but thank you
So,
for being
sure.
so informative.
Winston, you had a question?
Yes, I did. So when I think about PFAS, and I think about like plastics, right? Or so why is it, or what's the connection, or is there any similarity between I'm trying to ask about like the black plastic that farmers
Yeah.
are like allowed to use. And from my understanding, it's been found that like that degrades over time and that gets into the soil and that can be absorbed by plants. And still, that's something that farmers can use and still be considered like organic, right? They can still maintain their organic certification. So I guess I want to know, is there a connection between PFAS and black plastic or any other plastics that's used? Yeah, I guess I'll start with that.
Yeah, so there's not really a like PFAS, depending on the PFAS, it's used for different things. So like PFTE is a PFAS, and it's also a type of plastic, and it's used in things like Teflon and things like that. So it's in your cookware and whatnot. PFAS in general is not generally in plastics, with some exceptions, like it's added to fluorinated containers for like pesticides and stuff like that, for a variety of reasons of keeping the pesticides like from leaking and that type of stuff. It's not necessarily in the black plastic. That does not mean that the plastic itself is not causing harm, because there are a whole bunch of other toxic chemicals in plastic. As we have seen in the news, microplastics are ending up like they're like crossing the blood-brain barrier. They're ending up in our hearts, our lungs, sperm, all of this type of stuff. Microplastics are like a huge, huge problem, and they are basically just broken down plastic. And there are so many toxics in plastic that it's not even, it's crazy. Doesn't necessarily mean it's PFAS, but it is a different problem. Like it is a problem. It is a little bit of a different problem. And some black plastics, I don't know about the stuff they spread on farmland, but like I don't know if folks saw a few months ago that like the black plastic you use, like the dish containers that you get from like the Chinese restaurants that have like the black bottom and the plastic top, or if you've got like the black plastic from Amazon as like the stuff that you have in your kitchen to like cook with or bake with or whatever, those had massively high levels of flame retardants in them, which is another toxic chemical. And when you heat that, that makes it even worse. So never reheat your Chinese food in the microwave in the container that they give it to you. If you can afford it and you have those black plastic utensils that like everybody and their dog, I had them, I threw them away. Try to replace those with silicone or some other stuff that is not made out of the black plastic, but I don't know if that black plastic is the same as the black plastic that's used on the farms. So, but plastic itself is a huge issue, from, cradle to grave, from creation to disposal, all across the life cycle of plastic is massively, massively a large issue. And so I know we're getting, we only have a few minutes left, but I just want to briefly talk, and I'm going to share my screen very briefly again here, about, and this, whoops, oh, great. So we start over. I need to go through. Okay. So going back to the plastic thing, and just in terms of like industry pitting climate activists against environmental public health activists. Now, I work for an environmental public health organization, but we would also consider ourselves a climate organization and cares what happens to our climate. All of these facilities that make PFAS contribute to global warming. plastics contributes to, the creation of plastics contributes to toxics and global warming. As I'm sure you're all aware, industry has said that they're, plan to double their plastics production, I think by 2040. Because, as folks move to electric cars and stuff like that, they need to still make money. So they're like, plastic, everybody loves our plastic. So plastic is becoming a bigger and bigger concern. But what is happening, and we've seen it in the legislature here in Maine this session, is that from a chemical perspective, industry is creating all of these new chemicals that are supposedly like climate friendly. So if you're looking at things like the chlorofluorocarbons that, used to be in a bunch of things like our refrigerants and stuff like that, those were bad for the environment. So they switched to hydrofluorocarbons. But then they found something wrong with the HFCs, and now they want to switch to HFOs. Well, hydrofluoroolefins might be much better when it comes to climate, but they are still as toxic. But what they're doing is, telling climate people, like, look, we're trying to do all of these good things and move these toxics so that they're climate friendly and all, and then you have these public health advocates that are like, but you're making maybe a cleaner, maybe cleaner air, but you're still killing people with cancer. And they're like, nobody's really shown that that's a thing, blah, 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 which is not true. But like, so they're pitting climate activists against toxics activists. And so, for example, this session, a lot of Republicans don't like clean energy, right? And so they're using the PFAS crisis in the state of Maine and trying to kill clean energy bills by saying that they're doing it because of PFAS. And so they're going in. So like Representative Reagan Paul, for some reason, has made it her entire mission to kill every clean energy project that we have here in the state, put in a bill to make it so that you would have to test for PFAS when you install solar and when you take down solar. And so her argument is because of this PFAS contamination that, and I'm going to take this down, that, we need to stop installing solar until we know if they're contaminating us with PFAS. It was solar and wind. There were several bills this session that tried to use chemicals as a reason for not going forward with clean energy projects. So they're pitting folks like me against folks like NRCM and whatnot. Now, we opposed all of Reagan Paul's stupid bills because we knew what she was trying to do, but but that is happening on a federal level, and that's a little harder to stop. And so, we are trying to, from like the organizations that work on toxics, are like doing our best to create relationships with the environmental, particularly the climate folks, to show that like this doesn't have to be either or, it should be both. We should be protecting public health while at the same time protecting climate, and industry should be forced to do both. And so, so just flagging that as a thing. And like, and the other thing that they are trying to do, which is a little outside you guys' purview, but I'll flag it, is trying to pit toxics folks against like Planned Parenthood. So there was a bill this session that would have required manufacturers of mifepristone, which is an abortion drug, if that was found in wastewater, the manufacturers would be on the hook to treat the wastewater for mifepristone, because mifepristone is an endocrine disruptor. It's not. And there's literally no way to treat wastewater for mifepristone, but that once again puts somebody like me who like cares about what ends up in our wastewater and doesn't want bad stuff to end up in like our landfills and stuff like that, against communities that are trying to protect women's health. And so they're very good, very good at this stuff. But like, so just flagging as you guys are doing your work, like it's a false dichotomy to say we need to protect climate at the expense of chemicals and at the expense of what we're putting into our facility or into our things. So like from a refrigerant perspective, VW, all of their electric cars are going to be PFAS free by I think 2030 or 2032. GE is coming up with a natural refrigerant for their refrigerators and for their heat pumps and stuff like that. Heat pumps are a big thing here in Maine. Most of them have PFAS in them. And so they're using that as an excuse to be like, look, we want to move away from heating oil here in the state of Maine, but these pesky toxics people don't want you to be able to install a heat pump. And so those arguments are becoming more and more frequent in the legislature. And so from our perspective, we should be protecting climate, but also protecting public health. And so that's just something I want to flag, because you guys, you know, Maine Youth for Climate Justice, you care about climate, you care about what's happening. And, you know, we would hope, and we work very closely with, we're very lucky here in Maine. I'm very close to all of the environmental folks. We can have those conversations. But as we start to look at the federal level, it's a little tougher, and they're really doing a good job of pitting climate folks against environmental public health folks. So with that, I will see if there are any more questions. So.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about um what are you doing to combat some of those like false dichotomies and people trying to weaponize testing toxins to delay progress?
So a lot of it is just relationship building. So like I said, here in Maine, we're pretty lucky. We're Defend is part of the Environmental Priorities Coalition, as is MYCJ. So we are already in those rooms. We're not, as Maine is a small state, kind of everybody knows everybody. It's a little bit easier. On the federal level, you know, the organizations that we work with within the toxic space, we have our own, like, you know, national coalition of statewide folks and folks that work at the national level are trying to go to the conferences, trying to go to the meetings, trying to educate the climate folks on it doesn't have to be an either or. And look, we totally get the climate aspect being really important. But you know, we're both on the same side of this issue here and wanting to protect people. So I think a lot of it has to be education at this point. Because I do, so for instance, in Nevada, a bad bill was just passed, and Nevada has an incredibly progressive legislature. They passed a PFAS ban, but they exempted refrigerants and fluoropolymers because industry convinced them that they had to for climate reasons. But there were no toxics organizations that work on the ground in Nevada. And so we tried our best from far away, but like we're not the organization, you know, the organization, there was no toxics organization on the ground. So I think from our perspective, we need to start playing in states where we haven't played before. We need to build up our capacity, and we need to do a better job of being in your guys' spaces and explaining the issues to you, and also seeing where we can learn from you or from climate activists, and where climate activists can learn from us. So I think a lot of it is, you know, for a while there we were fine, and then, you know, things kind of exploded, and it's become a little tougher. So I think relationship building and education at this point is the thing that we're really trying to do, be in the spaces where the climate folks are working, so that we can be like, look, here is a solution to what you're trying to solve that also doesn't impact what we're trying to do, and providing that information. And like I said, learning from the folks that do the climate work too, and see if there's things that we can do better and about how we talk about things. So, and plastics is a good example of that, right? There's so many toxics in plastic, but from a climate perspective, plastic is like awful. You know, so that I think is an area of real opportunity for collaboration to try to, like, because if we do source reduction for plastics, we're helping the climate and we're helping the toxics perspective as well, because it is like dual impact to deal with that. So I think that's a good opportunity or a good space for us to collaborate with climate folks. It's an area of like shared concern. So.
A quick question on is there any more direct causal kind of relationship between PFAS and cancers? I know when I was looking into peas, they said, well, if you have one of these, but it didn't seem like there was any direct connection. Has any R&D, is there any R&D evidence? Because part of the education is, hey, you know, you're at risk for leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma, and if that's been proven, that would be great information for the public to know, because then people are going to say, you know what, it's not just people waving their arms.
Right.
Like if you look at youth cancer rates, it's something else is systemic in our environment.
So I just put in the chat, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine released PFAS testing guidance. And the Agency on Toxic Substance Disease Registry also has guidance and about health impacts of PFAS. And so there is proof that it causes or increases certain types of cancer, kidney cancer, testicular cancer, neurodevelopmental issues in children. It impacts vaccine efficacy, all of these things. All of that stuff is proven and known. We know that. So there's NASEM guidance that came out with how clinicians should deal with that. There is a fabulous doctor here in Maine. Her name is Dr. Rachel Criswell. She is a family doctor out of Skowhegan. She is treating about 50-ish PFAS impacted farmers. She and another doctor out of Portland are doing a study on, PFAS impacts and possible things that they can do to lessen the amount of PFAS in your body. There's a couple of medications that are, currently prescribed for other things that seem to be helping, get some of the PFAS out of your system. And so they're doing a bunch of studies around that. So Maine really is ground zero for some of that really kind of cutting edge medical work around what we can do for PFAS. So Dr. Criswell is fabulous. If you ever get a chance to hear her speak, I highly recommend it. She's so knowledgeable and so smart and so empathetic that it's just amazing. And they're in the process of, her and Dr. Fleischer in the process of doing a study. I think it'll probably be published in they have to still do the peer review and stuff like that. So that takes some time. But within the next couple of years, they'll have some real good evidence specifically out of Maine about, cancer, health impacts along with things that we might be able to do to help those with high levels of PFAS in their system. So
Is there any one place to go for like updates on these studies and the results and so on?
I don't know if I'm sure that they're going to be publishing it, but you don't want to read a bunch of medical journals.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can feel free to, reach out to me if you want to. We keep in very close contact with Dr. Criswell
Okay.
and are happy to, I'll put my email in the chat.
Oh, that was my question, actually, is could you send
Right. Super.
email in
Super.
the
Thank
chat
you.
so we can get a hold of you?
Yeah. So, and, I mean, there are studies happening all the time around the health impacts of PFAS. They're generally focused on a few, but you can extrapolate because of they're all bioaccumulative, that carbon fluorine bond is the strongest in nature, a lot of those health impacts are going to be the same across, from PFAS to PFAS, or environmental impacts are going to be the same from PFAS to PFAS. So they're trying to expand upon that. We are, if anybody is all interested, there's been a couple of books that have come out around PFAS in the past couple of months. We're doing a book series over the next couple of months with those authors to talk about it. I think Dr. Criswell might be at one of them. So, that might be an interesting one. And, you can sign up for our newsletter if you want to, and we're sending out information about those, but you can also just reach out to me and be like, hey, what's going on with that stuff? And I'm happy to forward things to you. So, and I'll put our website down there in there too, so you guys can see. And you can, if you choose to, sign up to get our information. So yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. Maine is ground zero. The other thing that is really interesting, I know we're getting to the end. The other thing that's really interesting is that the legislature just passed a bill that is giving the Department of Agriculture the authority to set levels for PFAS in food. So farm products, so they have milk and beef standards, but they're advisory kind of standards. So this will allow the state to go in and say, you can't sell, your radishes if they're above, 5 parts per trillion or whatever it is. So they've just gotten the authority to do that from the legislature. The Maine CDC has some really good information on their website about PFAS. Dr. Andy Smith, who's a state toxicologist, has done some amazing farmland research and health research and all that type of stuff. So the Maine DEP, Maine Department of Ag, and then Maine CDC all have PFAS specific websites. And there's a ton of information on each one of them. So if you're want to dig into one particular, whether it's the farm stuff or what the DEP is doing around products, or what the CDC is doing around health, they do have a bunch of really good information on their websites. So. Any other questions?
So many. But I have your email address. So.
Yes, you do. You do. So, and now you work.
Take it off.